Chapter 11 of Across the Andes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by James T. Oligny. Across the Andes by Charles Johnson Post. Chapter 11. Waiting for the Lecos. For a month we waited in this tiny straggling rectangle of thatched huts before the balsas or cayapos could get up to us to move our outfit down the river. Somewhere below us on the turbulent river, Leco crews were toiling up against the current, dragging and clawing their way through narrow canyons, hanging fast in places to the bare rock, and again helped by the long tropical vines that drooped to the swift water. Twice they had been beaten back by sudden rises in the river. The third time they got through, although 2 balsas had been wrecked, and for the past 2 days they had lived mainly on the berries and leaves along the jungle banks. A splendid lot of half-civilized people, tremendous of muscle and capable of prodigious feats of strength and endurance on their rivers. Ashore sober and diffident, afloat on their rafts, by right of an immemorial custom they were always drunk and serenely confident in their intuitive skill. For 24 hours after they arrived on the hot stone beach below the bluff on which Mapiri lived, they drank and feasted and slept, and then their headman, a Bolivian refugee, announced that all was in readiness. The gang of workmen we had chartered were collected and counted, and then assigned to the 3 cayapos, a queer lot, but in the main fairly promising for our purposes. One was a Negro who had been a rubber picker down the river before. During his absence his wife had left him, preferring a gentleman of lighter color, but who had only one eye. Some frontier mechanic had hammered a patch out of a silver coin, and then engraved with a nail the ragged outlines of an eye, which the owner proudly wore as a most elegant makeshift. Both of these gentlemen were in the outfit, and ordinarily both would boast in the utmost good nature of their fascinations with the ladies, except when they were in the process of getting drunk. And on the Bolivian frontier, getting drunk is recognized as a perfectly legitimate pastime. There are no games, no concerted forms of amusement. The montaña offers nothing except these little gatherings with some childish hopping as a dance, and then the tin cans of cañaça and the ensuing drunkenness. There was another man in the gang, a stocky, loose-jointed fellow, Segurando, who was never sober, except during his working hours. But during that time he was worth any 2 of the other men, and he never failed to turn up sober for that allotted period. His capacity was nothing. 3 times in one afternoon in Mapiri he was sober and drunk, with the lines of demarcation startlingly distinct. He rarely joined in the little hoppings to the reed whistle with his face daubed with clay or charcoal and decorated with bits of twigs or leaves, yet he was perfectly sociable and never dangerous. Later, in the established camp down the river, there came a 3-day fiesta for which he prepared in advance. There was a falca, a still for making the cañaça from a half-wild sugar cane up the river, and he drove his bargain before the fiesta began. He was, for the sum of 1 Boliviano, about $50 gold, to be allowed to drink all he chose during the 3 days, but he was to carry none away. Long before dawn on the first day he was at the falca. For 3 days he never moved from the litter of crushed sugar cane, lying in a stupor from which he only roused himself to reach out shakily for a tin cup of warm alcohol as it dripped from the still worm. We expected a wreck to show up, but on the morning of the 4th day he returned, grinning cheerfully, and worked as though nothing had occurred. Also there was Nosario, a stocky boy of about 12 or 14, who had been added as general utility around the cook or camp. He was worthless, and it later developed that his wife, a Cholo lady of some 30 or 40 years, had prodded him into the effort in order to add to her matrimonial support. Agamemnon viewed the whole collection with great scorn. "These your people ain't no as fittin' baz," he would remark. The other darky was included in his disfavor. Agamemnon always swelled with pride at the thought that he was a Britisher by birth, born in Barbados, and he counted Americans as being too subtly differentiated to be separated. Humbly accepting his place as assigned in their eyes, he looked down with scorn on these shambling, good-natured animals. During the 4 weeks of delay in Mapiri we had seen much of a neighboring rubber baron, old man Violand, whose baraka was a half-day's ride over the steep trails. The old man was as typically Teutonic as though he had but just pushed his mild, blue-eyed way into the jungle. His headquarters, a square of palm-thatched and palm-walled buildings, was self-sustaining from the coarse flour that a row of Indian women were grinding between heavy stones in one corner of the patio, to his coffee, and also a superior brand of cañasa distilled in a wooden worm, cooled in a hollow palm log, which really had the flavor of a fine liqueur. He had been the chief figure in a couple of rubber wars over disputed territory with his nearest neighbor some 30 miles away, and he showed a spattering of bullet holes in every room of his house with delighted pride. The dispute was a trifle complicated, but, as the result, his opponent was a fugitive from Bolivia, while Violand himself tiptoed into Sarada or occasionally La Paz with some caution. Often during the month we rode down to see him. He would have had us stay there for life. No sooner did our mules round the shoulder of the hill than we could see some small Indian boy darting off with the news. The familiar figure of the old man would bulk in the doorway to confirm the news, and then his voice would begin booming out orders. Chickens squawked, sheep blatted, and at once the place was a turmoil of pursuit. From an outbuilding would come the blue smoke of fresh fires and the shrill clacking of the well-grimed Aymara cook summoning her family help. Always were we greeted thus, and always there was a ready crowd of Indians at our heels on the crest of the boom to take the mules when we arrived and feed and water or put them up for the night. The formalities over, or properly supervised, Violand would seat himself at a huge table with the top a single plank of solid mahogany 3 inches thick, and before the ingredients for a gin cocktail. At his elbow a tiny little girl, one of the daughters of the Aymara cook, took her position to trot out for anything lacking in the first array. A gin cocktail is sugar, Angostura bitters, and gin, and I have seen it served in full goblets. All the rest of the forenoon the host would busy himself compounding this. It made not the slightest difference whether anyone else in the party joined him or not. Genially he would attend to it himself in little sips whose cumulative effect was prodigious. As the midday breakfast hour approached, he would roar for pisco, a species of Peruvian brandy, and then, as the little Aymara maiden announced the final hour of nutrition, champagne. And then the dinner. Half a sheep or a whole pig, and once the head of a young bullock to whose cooking the old man had given personal attention, waddling back and forth from the mahogany table to the cookhouse, accompanied by the little Aymara girl fluttering in a state of ecstatic excitement. For the rest, there were the chickens and the native foods, the chalona slowly simmered for a day to make it taste like food, with the chunya floating in it like so many old medicine corks. The chickens, the platanos, boiled green and pith-like or better in their black, melting overripeness and to be eaten with a spoon, baked and delicious. Native bread from homemade flour, and imported preserves for dessert. Also, there was champagne and whiskey and pisco and cañasa and gin cocktails again, until, in final triumph, a little beer, everything lukewarm or tepid from the shallows of the tropical brook. By and by the old man would venture on a German song or two, and then beckon to the little beady-eyed Aymara girl. Off she would dart to return with a couple of heavy-footed Indian women. The host would rise, with assistance, and trolling some uncertain song march off to his bedroom to doze. And the rest of the time would be spent with his son and manager, both fine, pink-cheeked young Germans who looked after affairs. It sounds like a wassail, though as a matter of fact it was old Violand who was the chief performer. He was an old man, civilization was far away, 8 days to La Paz over pass and plateaus and blizzard, and after that to Germany, 6 months for a letter and an answer. Later, he would reappear suddenly, generally clad in a shrimp pink bath gown, a patent German emperor mustache shaper over his mustache, and groping for his spectacles. When they were found, he once more settled himself for a pleasant time, generally having to go through a second search for a key so that another bottle of bitters could be produced. The morning after, he would appear, fresh and blue-eyed and solicitous. "You have a good time, yes?" Then he would chuckle until he shook in ponderous ripples and go on in Spanish. "I do not remember much after dinner yesterday. A good dinner, yes? A good dinner is much in this country of the black gold. The rubber, yes? We drink a little for the digestion, la, yes. Hoi, mozo!" The little Indian girl clattered inside for the bottles. "Just one little cocktail before the saddle, yes?" His face would beam in its frame of thin whiskers with the proudly upstanding German emperor mustaches, the center of their radiations. In the jungles across the river from Mapiri was another rubber baraka in which a Bolivian owner held court. Every morning we could see a dozen thin threads of blue smoke trickling above the forest where his pickers were smoking their morning collection of rubber milk. Over there, the cañasa was always on draft for all at all times, while half the week was a fiesta and Sunday a brawling bedlam. Slowly the days dragged on with an occasional rumor of the progress of the Lecos and the Queyapos. Once, as much to furnish a variation as anything else, I routed out a couple of jars of mincemeat and ventured on some pies. An oven was heated, a big clay dome such as our great-great-grandmothers used, from out of which the fire was drawn, and on a long-handled paddle I shoved in a load of pies. Almost instantly they browned and then passed to a crisp black before the paddle could maneuver them out again. The native population, however, appreciated them highly. It was small loss, as the manufacture of pie crust is somewhat of an undertaking, at least in that tropical temperature. The lard, native or imported, is a beautiful amber liquid that is brought or carried in bottles and pours with no more deliberation than so much water. A little later, a general fiesta in Mapiri helped out the dull waiting a little. We noticed an extra number of candles burning before the altar in the little mud-walled church, and for some days before there had been the thrumming of hollow tree drums from the little huts of the village. The night before the great day, while it was scarcely dark, the big drums began booming with a typical Indian rhythm. From the line of huts came the droning wail of the guests that rose and fell in fitful bursts, while now and again a straggling line of drunken cholos, men and women, in a weaving single file, trotted in a staggering hop around the grass-grown plaza. There was feasting and drinking and noise. From the baraka across the river came a delegation to lend a joyous hand. Toward morning it died down, slumbered uneasily during the forenoon, and then began working to a frenzy of excitement as evening approached. All the drums had been concentrated in the church. Tallow dips lined the walls, attached by their own tallow to the sun-baked clay, and cast uncertain masses of shifting shadows that flickered in the hot and smoky draughts. Overhead a flood of bats chittered in amazement at the invasion of their domain. On one side of the church were squatted all of the old women in Mapiri with dull, cañasa-bleared eyes and cheeks distended with coca leaves, hammering out a monotonous rhythm on the drums. Before the altar and facing it side by side were two lines of the smaller boys, with the tallest at the front, and then shading down to the rear, each naked to the waist but for some cheap necklaces of gay beads. Each had a forked twig like those we use for our juvenile slingshots, and strung on a wire or twisted bark thread that connected the forks were a dozen little bits of flat tin hammered out of old sardine cans. Like castanets, they jiggled the forked stick in rhythm with the drums, and as they jiggled, shuffling in a hopping, dancing lockstep in a single file up to the altar, and then back in the same way, half the depth of the beaten earth floor. As one file advanced, the other jiggled back, and so on alternately. For hours they had kept it up, and there was no sign of either a stop or a rest. The rest of the villagers flitted in or out as ordinary spectators, still nibbling at portions of the feast or sharing a continuously filled bottle of cañaça with the drumming old women. It was not until daybreak that Mapiri dropped into an exhausted rest. During this fiesta there had been no shooting of dynamite, that is, quarter-pound sticks with a short fuse like a firecracker. This once more popular amusement had been dampened by the last really important fiesta they had celebrated. A Cholo gentleman had, it seemed, zigzagged out into the grass-grown plaza with his stick of dynamite, lighted it from his cigarette, and then, in a drunken effort to throw it away, had dropped it. He did not notice this trifling difference in his program, and, swinging dizzily round with the effort of his throw, fell sprawling upon the cartridge. His demise is still spoken of with awe on that river. Therefore it was that Mapiri celebrated a quiet fiesta. And then the balsas arrived. Their Lecco crew gorged and slept and drank for a day, and then were as fresh as ever, busy in lashing each 3 balsas together with cross logs to make cayapos for the downstream voyage. 3 of these cayapos we had, and, when loaded with their freight, crews, and workmen passengers, their logs were 4 inches under water, the little platforms on which the baggage was piled and carefully lashed, rising like a little island on stilts above the current. End of chapter 11.